Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Wednesday seminar series. Today we have Matthew Shutzer, who is a scholar of modern South Asia and global history writing. He's writing a book about modern South Asia and global history writing about fossil fuels and India's developmental state in the 20th century. His past writing has appeared in Comparative Studies in Society and History. It's a recent publication, and History Compass, and other academic and public-facing venues. Uh, he's a He's currently a Siriasi Von Trapp Fellow in the Natural Resource Economics and Political Economy at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to this, he was at the Weatherhead Center at Harvard as a postdoctoral fellow. I think, apologies for that. I think that's the affiliation, Matt, which is there on the older affiliation, which is there on the poster. So apologies for that. And Matt finished his PhD at NYU at the history department. Thank you, Matt, for making time and sharing your work with us. And the basic housekeepings, you have about 30 to 35 minutes, which can creep into 40. I won't be a very hard taskmaster, but around 35 minutes, I'll probably send you a chat message, just in terms of maybe you could conclude around the next 5 minutes. And we'll keep about 15-20 minutes, whatever time is left for discussion. Okay, thank you for joining us, and over to you, Matt.
Great. Okay, thanks. Can you see my PowerPoint? Is that coming clear on my screen?
I can see it.
Okay.
I hope everybody else can see it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna just jump in then. Okay. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for coming. It's so nice to actually see a couple of Zoom names that I'm familiar with, and so it's I'm really happy to be here today. So as Anandarup said, my name is Matt Shutzer. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Geography at the University of California, Berkeley. I really want to thank the Department of Historical Studies for hosting me, and I also really want to thank Professor Anandarup Sen for inviting me. I've known Anandarup now for almost a decade, and I've learned immensely from him as a scholar, as a colleague, as a friend. And I'm so grateful that he has had me come here today to share some of this work in progress. So I'm speaking today not from California, but from the Hudson Valley of upstate New York in the eastern United States, on the ceded territory of Munsee Mohican people who lived in this region prior to its colonization by white Christian settlers from Northwestern Europe. And of course, we are meeting today at a time of really pronounced pain and suffering caused by the second wave of the pandemic in India, as well as in other parts of the world. I raised this at the beginning because it would be impossible not to reflect on what is happening in India today while discussing India's past, and in particular as we think of friends, family, and colleagues impacted by an event that very clearly should not be taking place. So I frequently find myself wincing when academics try to contort their own intellectual projects to somehow sort of speak to the present moment as they perceive it to be. But I'd like you to perhaps indulge me this morning or this afternoon, for you all, for many of you, in thinking today a bit about some of the historical origins of the conjoined crises that are now circling around us in the present. In my work specifically, I'm thinking through the crises of climate change and the crises of capitalism together. Although I will only be able to present a sort of small version of this work, its aim overall, and I'll return to this in the conclusion, is to think through the ongoing and unfinished project of decolonization in South Asia, but also in other parts of the world. So my talk today is a summary of an article that comes out of a larger book manuscript that thankfully is sort of nearing its conclusion. The book is called, or will be called, The Energy State, South Asia, Fossil Fuels, and the Post-Colonial Origins of the Climate Crisis. So in the book, I'm trying to answer a perhaps seemingly commonsensical question that many of you might already sort of have, insofar as you thought about it in these terms, some sort of ready-made answers for. My question is, well, why did India come to build one of the largest fossil fuel producing economies on Earth in the age of decolonization? So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Indian energy context, India today is the world's third largest fossil fuel economy, trailing only China and the United States. The Indian economy primarily depends on coal, much like South Africa, for powering industry and electrification, but it is also one of the world's largest oil importers. Now, if we go back to the moment of Indian independence in 1947, the vast majority of the Indian population depended not on fossil fuels or commercial sources of energy, or sources of energy bought sort of in regulated and open markets for everyday cooking, heating, or transport needs, but on the burning of biomass and forest produce. Today, however, the situation is dramatically reversed. While India remains a relatively small energy consuming country in per capita terms due to the large size of its population, fossil fuels are imbricated in the everyday lives of Indian citizens in a way previously unimaginable. This world historical transformation of the energetic bases of Indian economic life is now particularly significant in light of the global crisis of climate change. So efforts to decarbonize economies in the global south have been met with the now well-known objections that countries like India and many countries in Africa as well have historically contributed relatively little to global greenhouse gases because of their late start in adopting fossil energy, and so should be allowed a longer time horizon to phase out their own fossil fuel dependencies. This is what is often understood as climate equity, as it is applied on a country-by-country basis for calculating historical carbon emissions. Though, of course, there are much more persuasive models of calculating these distributions not focused on nation states, but on levels of incomes. The distinction being that it's not actually across countries that we see the most inequality in carbon emissions historically, but rather across income groups, with the global rich contributing the vast majority of carbon emissions. But if this is the kind of larger significance or the contemporary significance of sort of where India's oil question or fossil fuel question comes out, my question in kind of framing this historically is really one of how did we get here, right? How did we get to this moment where decolonization, an era of emancipatory possibility, an era of hope, kind of has become an era that now confronts us in the present as a potential history of our present catastrophe. So, although much of my book is primarily concerned with the political ecology of coal extraction, right, India's sort of primary energy source, I want to focus today on oil. In fact, it is my suggestion that we cannot think about global regimes of fossil fuel production and consumption without thinking about the ongoing relationship between coal and oil. From the perspective of the global south, there is no successive age of coal or age of oil heralded in the endless marketing copy of epochal historical thinking, but rather the constant and dynamic interplay of these two energy sources under specific historical and geopolitical structures. My reason for turning to oil today is because it allows us to focus on the international dimensions of the global energy system and the role specifically of global financial structures in bringing into being the worldwide proliferation of petroleum between the 1950s and the 1970s and the 1970s, the kind of high tide of decolonization. So oil sometimes gets into the scheme of power. Who said this? Yeah. This comes from a letter written by India's first petroleum minister in 1956 to the Indian Minister for Finance, arguing for the creation of a nationalized oil company controlled and owned by the Indian state. In much of what follows, I will be describing the conditions surrounding the creation of this nationalized oil company and how we might think about its significance conceptually and historically, basically how oil gets into the scheme of power. So the person who wrote this letter is pictured here on the right, K.V. Malviya, presumably being lectured to here by the person on the left, who is the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. So Malviya, who was a veteran of the Indian nationalist movement, coming from one of the sort of most important nationalist families in northern India, he was a close ally of Nehru. He had been imprisoned with him in the 1940s in the nationalist struggle. And when he was appointed to the post-colonial government, he became associated with the left-wing faction of the Indian National Congress, the ruling party that came to power after the departure of the British in 1947. So a staunch socialist, Malviya was one of the figures within the early Indian state who tried to bring the government closer to the line of economic policy making associated with another political party, the Praja Socialist Party, and to articulate a vision of developmentalist governance that was antagonistic to the interests of the Western Bloc. So one of Malviya's kind of core features of his sort of ideological program as oil minister was its anti-imperialist character, very much in the vein of a kind of a sort of militant Bandung socialist attitude towards the Western Bloc. So in the 1950s, when the Indian government began contemplating Malviya's plans for nationalizing the Indian oil sector, this was a time of global upheaval in oil and in the decolonizing world. In 1953, a wildcat drill rig owned by the British oil company Assam Oil struck an oil field in the forests of Nohar in the northeastern Indian state of Assam. Although British oil companies had been working in India since the early 20th century, the Nohar discovery was heralded as the first major oil field discovered in independent India. Immediately, Malviya worked to cancel a colonial-era mining lease that guaranteed the Nohar reserve to the British company and began planning for the Nohar oil field to form the basis of a new government-owned oil company. He and Nehru in this process were confronted by both British and US oil firms who threatened the Indian government with financial and geopolitical reprisal. The same year as the Nohar discovery, two critical events took place that overshadowed the rest of the history of oil in this period. First, the Americans and the British had staged a coup in Iran against their Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, after the Iranians nationalized the oil fields and refinery that was subsequently controlled by British Petroleum. This happens in the same year as the discovery of the oil field in India. And second, in that same year, in Brazil, the president Getulio Vargas committed suicide. So for many on the left within the Indian government, Vargas's suicide was deeply suspicious. And these politicians connected it to his previous efforts to oust the US-owned Standard Oil Company from the Brazilian economy, which had led to the establishment of the Brazilian-owned oil company that we know today as Petrobras. As Arthur Lal, India's consul general in New York, wrote to Malviya following Vargas's suicide, quote, "Wherever American capital goes, there is clear evidence it seeks to take control, including political control." Indeed, the British oil companies warned Malviya and Nehru not to follow the Iranian or Brazilian path, in their words. Nevertheless, after 1956, the Indian government established an oil program modeled on Brazil's Petrobras, the Indian Oil and Natural Gas Corporation. The ambition of the corporation, which I'll refer to from here on as the ONGC, was to make India independent from the political and economic influence of Western oil companies. It was for the Indian state, as it was for Mossadegh in Iran and Vargas in Brazil, an attempt to realize, and this is crucial, the political promise of decolonization through an assertion of economic sovereignty. Okay. So this brings us to the kind of main question structuring my intervention here relating to oil, okay? So the question I want to pose to all of you is, why did oil become a privileged object of sovereign claim making in the decolonizing world? Why oil, right? Why do we see from the 1950s onward these incredible attempts by decolonizing countries to challenge US and British dominance over global oil resources? What the historian Christopher Dietrich has actually called an oil revolution, undertaken by countries in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East to declare oil resources the sovereign property of the nation state. What did this mean? Yeah. I think to understand this, we have to actually unpack this larger question into two parts. Okay. So the first part, I think, is we need to understand what is particular about oil. What was it about oil that lent this peculiar political salience in the first decades of decolonization? And second, once we understand why oil, we need to ask, what is the relationship between oil and post-war conceptions of sovereignty? And so for the remainder of the talk, it will be the interplay between these two questions, or these two sort of ancillary aspects of this structuring question that I'm going to be trying to pursue, hopefully coming to terms with a new conception of post-war sovereignty rooted in our history of oil. So let's get at the first part of that question, right? Why oil? Okay. Well, scholarship as it exists at present, it doesn't really have an explanation why as of yet, right? It's not really actually been a sort of central part or a central animating concern of the existing scholarship. The basic explanation is descriptive, right? It's about the massive increases in global oil production following the Second World War, as the United States, which had been the world's preeminent oil economy, boasting nearly 70% of global oil output and refining capacity, began to meet competition from overseas producers, especially in the Middle East. And this is the moment in which the US Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, began to recognize that in order for America's, quote, gasoline civilization to carry on, the country was going to need external sources of supply. Quote, the world oil empire, in his words, was on the move after World War II to the Middle East, but to other places as well. So this is kind of a descriptive account, right? That was just this massive moment of increases in production, right? And this happens after World War II in 1945. And it's this period that scholars now refer to as the Great Acceleration, right? When global fossil fuel production reaches unprecedented levels, but particularly oil, it begins to ascend as the world's most important fossil fuel commodity, right? So what does this mean? How have scholars understood this? What does it mean when we talk about the Great Acceleration, okay? So often when we discuss the Great Acceleration, we are referring to this period of unprecedented growth in fossil fuel production and its associated impacts on what we now call the Anthropocene, right? Or the era in which Homo sapiens have become geological agents, driving geophysical shifts in our atmosphere and on Earth. As the scientists Mark Lewis and Simon Maslin remind us, the Anthropocene is not itself limited to an account of fossil fuel production, but can encompass all sorts of human impacts on planetary life. The burning of fossil fuels, however, remains one of the most key drivers of this process. And when we refer back to this question, linking the Great Acceleration with the Anthropocene, we're almost always referring to this article published in 2007 by Will Steffen, Paul Crutzen, and J.R. McNeil, which sort of set the kind of parameters of debate as they stand, right? But within this article, there's sort of a kind of absent of a, there's an absent causal mechanism, right? So while the authors sort of point to various features, there really isn't a kind of synthetic account of what's driving it, what's driving all of these sort of world historical increases in fossil fuel productivity. Several of the features that they point to sort of return again and again to the question of population growth, right? So for Steffen, Crutzen, and McNeil, population growth is key, right? And what they point out is that the increases in fossil fuel production that happen after 1945 map clearly on to increases in population growth, particularly in the global South. And this same argument has been taken up by Dipesh Chakrabarty in his sort of influential account of the Anthropocene, who sees population growth as driving profound ecological shifts in the 20th century, but that in his own account, right, he says that population growth itself was a accident of history. He doesn't actually sort of develop or point to a kind of social or structural mechanism by which population growth might be related to these factors, right? And it's really unclear what he means by an accident of history or how he might substantiate that historically. I think this type of thinking and this turn to population is indicative of what I might call, or what we might call, supply side theory making, right? It's a way of thinking that suggests there's some kind of natural mapping together between population growth and increases in fossil fuel production without any account of why more people on Earth might mean more fossil fuels, right? Why do more people on Earth need to consume more fossil fuels? It's a kind of replay of Say's law. Production meets its own virtuous demand. Population maps equally onto increases in fossil fuel growth, right? And the really only way that these types of Malthusian accounts can make sense of what's happening after 1945 is by returning to what we might think of as a transhistorical concept of energy, right? So energy has to emerge in these accounts as a transhistorical subject. Human beings have, of course, always been making energy, right? Agriculture is a type of energy conversion. Eating meat is a kind of energy conversion, so on and so forth. What's distinct about the period after 1945 is not the turn to energy, but its sort of scale, right? And so we're left with an analysis that suggests, oh, fossil fuels are just a continuation of a biological propensity to create ever more complex energy systems, right? And this kind of sort of caricatured understanding that I have at this bottom here, but I think is sort of actually extracted from these texts, right? That caloric transformations effectively become understood as the same frame of reference as an oil rig, right? So there is also an alternative model of thinking beyond this, of thinking the kind of why question after 1945, right? Beyond this kind of Malthusian approach. So in a more historically grounded account, Timothy Mitchell, in his 2011 book, Carbon Democracy, one of his arguments is that oil became so significant after 1945 because of its centrality to US geopolitical power, which itself was an extension of an earlier imperial geography marked out by the British Empire in the Middle East. So for Mitchell, oil is a lens, right, through which we can begin to see the different ways or assemblages that modern political power has been constituted by enrolling infrastructure and carbon resources. And crucially, this is not about capitalism or a logic of commodities, right? But for Mitchell, rather, commodities and capital are an effect of the type of power infrastructure produced by oil. So, broadly speaking, I'm sympathetic to Mitchell's account, and particularly his turn to the geopolitical. I think it tells us a lot about US and British geostrategic interests, as well as the interests undergirding petroleum producing countries. But I don't think it really gets us to an understanding of why countries around the world came to see petroleum as the basis of a project for achieving economic sovereignty. With Mitchell, we are still left with the underlying presumption that oil is a commodity to be consumed and that it will find its natural markets out in the world. But if we start to look at this problem from the perspective of what was then known as the Third World, as well as from India specifically, a new set of problems comes into view. First, we should note that it was not immediately after 1945 that oil became important to countries in the global South. It was really only in the 1970s that oil became a significant per capita consumer commodity, right? So this idea that the post-1945 period is this period of unprecedented fossil fuel growth is true, but it's geographically uneven, right? And particularly for countries in the global South, the 1970s is probably a better periodization, a better starting point. Moreover, India itself has never been a major oil exporter, right? At the time of independence, domestic oil production in India accounted for only 5% of India's petroleum requirements. And even today, India remains a net oil importer. So if we take those two facts, right, that in the 1950s, when all of this global oil production is taking off, India is neither a major contributor to the proliferation of oil production, nor is oil really that significant in per capita consumer terms to the Indian economy, right? There's just really not that much stuff for oil to do. The question arises, why was India in 1956 one of the first of the decolonizing countries to launch a government-owned oil infrastructure in the name of economic sovereignty? If it's not about the typical story of oil that we understand, it has to be about something else, right? India's program, after all, followed immediately from Iran and Brazil, but it predated the major nationalizations of the Middle East and African oil producers that would come to constitute OPEC in the 1960s. In many ways, the Indian model is one of the founding models. The answer, I want to argue, requires us to move away from both Malthusian and infrastructural explanations, and to finally bring the question of capital back into the history of oil. Although for many of us, that question had never really left. But sorry about that. Okay. And now when I say I want to bring capital back in here, right? I'm not sort of speaking in general, I'm speaking specifically, yeah? And the form of capital I want to bring back in is debt. So why debt? Like many decolonizing countries in the 1950s, India's post-colonial leaders were convinced of the necessity of building a strong developmental state capable of channeling finance, natural resources, and labor towards the project of national economic growth. The belief in the developmental state was not unique to the post-colonial world, but was rather the outgrowth of a new economic consensus centered around state-led fiscal policy stimulus and economic planning that had directed the global recovery from the Great Depression after 1929. This is what was meant when C.D. Deshmukh, the first Indian governor of the Reserve Bank of India and one of the negotiators from the Indian delegation at the Bretton Woods Conference, declared in the late 1940s that the 20th century would go down as the century of economic planning, not just for the developing or decolonizing world, but for the world entirely. Even if state intervention was, broadly speaking, an acceptable type of economic orthodoxy in the 1950s, one of the aspects that made post-colonial development so unique was that it was undertaken by states with relatively weak financial standing within the asymmetries of post-war capitalism. Moreover, state-led economic development within post-colonial countries represented a direct form of competition with colonial-era firms and multinational corporations seeking to extract profits from these so-called developing areas. For the planners of India's developmental state, debt hung over their earliest ambitions to create a national economy free from predatory outside influences. India rather quickly became the single largest borrower of the World Bank's expansive lending portfolio after 1949. And what became clear even at this early moment is that the cost of petroleum imports represented one of India's largest expenditures of capital flowing out of the country, and that oil itself held a special relationship to the structure of Indian debt. So oil was and remains one of the most expensive outlays of Indian import spending, due to India's reliance on oil purchased almost entirely at the time in dollars and sterling that were traded against the weak domestic currency of the Indian rupee. As soon as 1954, even the comparatively paltry quantities of Indian petroleum imports accounted for 15% of the country's entire import bill. The disproportionate growth of external debts to finance petroleum consumption contributed to the foreign exchange crises of 1957 and 58 and 1966. And even as India remained one of the world's lowest petroleum consuming countries per capita, each oil-driven financial crisis produced a deepening of debt relations and restructuring of the Indian state. The most pronounced of these crises came during the petroleum price hike caused by the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the fallout from which could only be managed by a structural adjustment loan from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And this debt set the stage for the oil price shocks that accompanied the Gulf War in 1991, which was then again used to impose a new regime of economic liberalization in order to stabilize India's currency position, a moment that has had profound and far-reaching impacts into the present moment. So if in the last slide, I'm sort of trying to get at this disproportionate relationship between oil as a commodity and oil as a form of money, right? I want to flag something that I only mentioned in passing, right? And that's that when I talk about oil as money or oil as debt, right? I'm not talking about this in the abstract. I'm speaking of a very specific type of debt as well, and which in the case of oil for India, that meant debt that was denominated in these strong apex currencies of either pounds sterling or dollars. And the strong value of these currencies and the denomination of oil within them meant two critical things. First, it meant that for countries with weak currencies like India and the rupee, there was a disproportionate relationship between the quantities of oil India imported and their value in dollar or sterling terms to the Indian economy. Oil was, in effect, more powerful as an instrument of monetary extraction than as a commodity to be consumed, right? That's number one. Number two, it meant that countries that printed these currencies, the United States for the dollar and the UK for sterling, took a direct interest in the increasing circulation of the sale of oil denominated in their currencies. Now, I don't have time here to go into the longer term history of how these forms of money became structurally tied to oil, but the basic reason is that global oil economies emerged in the late 19th century within global geographies of empire. British India was one of the first experimental sites of colonial oil extraction and policymaking, which was subsequently exported to the Middle East, and West Africa. In British India, unlike other types of colonial businesses that came to trade and produce goods in Indian rupees, oil companies were always registered as sterling-based companies, much like tea plantations. And so they conducted their business and raised capital in one of the world's strongest currencies. After Indian independence in 1947, these companies effectively formed a kind of archipelago of continued British colonial power throughout the new nation states of the Indian Ocean world where they were active. In the post-colonial context, sterling oil provided a critical source of earnings to the British exchequer and allowed for the stabilization of Britain's currency amidst the unprecedented financial crises Britain encountered immediately after the Second World War. In this way, Britain's continued reliance on its overseas oil companies made it of the utmost importance that India, Iran, and Pakistan in particular maintain the debtor relationships of importing oil. I'm coming to the end here, and so I'm going to wrap up over the next two slides and just sort of briefly flag kind of how we might think of India's oil project. And K.D. Malviya, the man I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, had kind of emerged out of this sort of structural context. So in order to escape this debt, K.D. Malviya established the ONGC, the Oil and Natural Gas Commission, after 1956. In his words, the aim of the project was to produce, refine, and sell oil extracted in India, not in sterling or dollars, but in Indian rupees. Indian oil could be produced in Indian rupees, not in sterling or dollars. By producing Indian oil in rupees, Malviya believed India could at last, quote, become free from the bondage of the sterling balances of London, and also to a certain extent, the International Monetary Fund. This was not oil for oil's sake, but oil for the sake of money. This, I think, is a crucial distinction. If we are to denaturalize the expansion of oil in the post-war period, we need to understand that it was not that oil fulfilled a human need that other resources could not, but that oil was fundamentally tied to the expansion and valorization of the money supply of geopolitically dominant states. Of course, there are ways in which we can think of oil as a non-substitutable commodity, right? Indeed, in the era of the Green Revolution in particular, really from the 1960s onward, right, of this period of state and capital intervention in increasing global food supply, right? So in the period of the Green Revolution, increasingly the world's global food supply became harnessed the financial and infrastructural power of petrochemical industries. India's growing dependence on US capital and food markets during this period was based in close collaboration between the US government and petrochemical firms. However, there were all sorts of pathways India did not take in the 1950s, from investments in synthetic fuels produced through coal to solar and wind farms contemplated by Malviya as early as 1954. India was instead forced into a relationship of dependence with foreign oil companies based on the asymmetries of the global money system, what Manu Goswami and Adam Getachew have called, quote, sovereign inequalities. And in turn, under Malviya, came to use control over oil to manage the country's exposure to crises of external debt. I'm going to end here and will not be able to get fully into the main archival substance of the paper, which overall it sort of covers a decade-long battle between Malviya and the US and British oil companies that opposed India's program of nationalization. So in that paper, I explore critically how the oil companies attempted to represent a new legal regime for the protection of the rights of private capital investment over and against these sovereign rights of nation states, enshrined by the UN as permanent sovereignty over natural resources. And it's sort of from that exchange that I get the title of the article and also of this talk, Against Sovereignty, in the sense that corporate power and specifically money stand against sovereignty. So I'd like to conclude by simply taking up the theme I began with, namely the unfinished project of decolonization. And of course, this will be an unfinished attempt at addressing that theme. So ultimately, for whatever the flaws were contained within Malviya's project, the ethos of anti-colonial internationalism, which it embodied and was embedded in, was defeated. And the infrastructural project of the ONGC ultimately became routed through new financial arrangements after 1965 with the IMF, the World Bank, and the petroleum-producing nations of OPEC. All of this occurred well after Malviya was forced to depart his ministry under corruption charges. Today, the ONGC and other government companies hold a virtual monopoly over the petroleum sector in India, even as the country remains vulnerable to global fluctuations in pricing and supply, and few would suggest that these companies represent a challenge to the global energy system. If scholars once thought of neoliberalism as a history of the hollowing out of government institutions, we might actually think instead, using the case of India, as well, I think, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A also. We might actually think instead, using the case of India, of the persisting endurance of certain types of state capitalism as a stabilizing mechanism for the contradictory functioning of global markets. This, I think, is all the more reason for paying attention in the longer terms to the global history of oil, not as a Malthusian mechanism, nor as the endless unfolding of human and non-human relationships under contingent logics of power, but as part of the history of capitalism. When we begin to see oil not only for its use value, but as money itself, I think a more nuanced picture of how we ended up in the midst of our contemporary climate crisis can finally begin to emerge. Thanks very much. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for that. Thank you. It's a lot to process. Questions and comments. The floor is open. You don't have to. If you want, you can use the that hand app, or you can just switch on your mic on video and just ask the question directly. I'm just adjusting my gallery feed. Yes. Can't see any hands right now. So should I start? Yeah, I'll start. and maybe people are still processing it. Thank you for that, Matt. It's very interesting that my primary question is, without actually going into the, you've gone into the details of the debate, the larger debate which frames this literature. I think what I'm thinking and trying to process is that what then happens to the infrastructural history moment in this field, and if we are trying to return to decolonization as a problem of capital, how does the infrastructural moment actually speak to the moment of decolonization at all? Is the infrastructural moment, and by that I mean the Michel moment and the second level of this historiography, or the second stage of this historiography that you've outlined, how does it relate to, or does it relate to, how does matter of oil, or the materiality of oil relate to the debates of decolonization, or does it at all? Or do we actually come back? Because this is an old, in a way, this is an older argument. I mean, this is an older economic dependency argument of, and you're bringing capital in. While I understand that this is actually speaking to and moving forward from the infrastructural moment within the oil and energy historiography, but it kind of gloms onto an older what Bodhi was talking about in a different context, but Prabhat Patnaik, the older Marxist economic historians talking about how early decolonization was already impaired, or that moment. So I was just wondering what the infrastructure, if you could elaborate on, does the infrastructural study moment have any relation to histories of decolonization that you can see in this theoretical frame? I'm also thinking of Antina von Schnitzler's work, where a particular kind of decolonial moment in South Africa, understood in terms of water meters and the service delivery, configuration of service delivery protests, is actually located very much in the infrastructural politics. So this is very different that's a different approach of understanding the decolonial moment. So I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like I mean, so the way that I think about Mitchell's work in particular is I think that as a structural argument, right? When Mitchell poses the relationship between sort of infrastructures of our coal and the types of kind of labor and democratic political problems that emerge from that, as any kind of juxtaposes that against the kind of techno-political problems that emerge from oil. I think that that's totally right. I think that's a kind of interesting account of how we might think about the structural relationship between these forms of extraction and production and their political forms. As a historical argument, I don't think that the work is particularly useful. And I think you're right to suggest that the return to a kind of what would have been understood at the time, right, as a third world Marxist position, right, kind of critical account of the post-colonial state, its kind of imbrication or its relative weakness vis-a-vis forms of both national and international capital. In a way, it's a return. I agree. I also lament the departure. I think that actually the kind of overtaking of a sort of tradition of critical political economy, first by Foucault studies, and then in other areas, while I think that there were very clear examples of kind of marked improvements in those perspectives, I think that we're very much at a kind of moment in which there's or at least I feel that there's a kind of urgency to return to questions about the structural bases of state power, right? And I think that, you know, this is particularly present in the kind of history, I think what we kind of see as the legacy of this kind of non-political economic approach in the kind of history of development for South Asia, and in the history of infrastructure for South Asia, right? In which the state is actually the one kind of presenting all of the forms of sort of action in the world, right? And we don't really ever get a picture of the state as embedded in different structures or layers of capital. And so why the state does particular things or pursues particular avenues, or why certain things become possible at some moments and then not possible in others, is totally lost, right? And so we don't actually have a kind of textured, sort of structurally contingent account of what the developmental state is. And so in a way, I think what I want to do is I kind of want to like return to the third world Marxists, but after having read sort of return to them through the perspective of sort of infrastructure and yeah.
I have a couple of follow-up questions, because I'll see if there are other comments, questions before I jump into it. Comments, questions? Yes, Upal.
Thank you, Matt. This is a lot of this is also new for me, so really learned a lot, and your thinking is something I'm trying to follow still. And what I was, from what I've got so far, what I was thinking is that when you pose this question, you know, regularly in the course of the presentation, that why oil, why petroleum, it is still a question which has not got the kind of explanation which you are looking for. And you know, when you frame that question in terms of the descriptive account of jump in production since 45, which you map through the graph, I think is you know, an important point of departure in terms of thinking through the global dynamics of production itself to answer this question. But when you frame your own intervention in terms of looking at this question as a history of capital, and explain the condition of Indian history of petroleum in terms of that, you take us to certain imperial dependencies which are tied to the question of money as capital. But this, your focus on these networks, which are tied to money as capital in the case of oil, is not, you know, kind of brought back to any connection with the problem of production. Any you know, connection with the problem of production. So what I'm trying to think of is that if it's a history of capital, then the dependency networks that Anandu was referring to and what you have pointed out in terms of, you know, a certain relationship with oil being marked in sterling and the power of sterling and the dominance of those economies. What that means in terms of production, as in what is the specific dynamic of production which has made those dependencies possible? If we try to go back to the question of production and therefore touch upon the history of capital in terms of the question of production, then what would you say on that?
If I can just, Matt, just because there's a lot of time left, so I'll just actually add on to Paul's question, and that's my follow-up question. It's a couple of two things. One thing is that the Indian case, I'm thinking about the specific sustenance of the modularity of the Indian case, because I think you're trying to also tell us of a possible model of you know, thinking about oil sovereignty, organized around oil, and Indian case being a model in that. So I was wondering that, a lot of this Iran conversation particularly, isn't it about the fact that oil is much more central to the economy as a particular, single resource, a commodity and its relationship to the economy, than compared to, say, some place like India, which you show, and which has much to do with the way that the infrastructure around it and the conversations around it unfold. Second, I mean, in Mitchell, the argument would be just the opposite, that the infrastructure itself is creating the space of money or oil money as capital. It's actually infrastructure of oil through the rigs, through the connectivity and the geoempirical politics, that you are actually creating this money, this space, the space of economy. So it's in a sense, it's just the opposite argument. So I was just, and to kind of add to Upal's question of production. So maybe you could just respond to that.
Yeah. Thanks for both of those questions. So a couple of ways to answer that. To answer both of those questions, or at least begin to talk about them. So, one of the main critiques that Malviya has of the oil companies as he begins to get political power in the early 1950s is that they have actually not invested at all meaningfully in geophysical prospecting across the subcontinent in trying to find new sites of production. And that in fact, they have deliberately limited the amounts of productive sources and productive oils and productive flows of oil that could come online, even prior to the 1950s. And so he's particularly interested in a kind of series of controversies that come up in the 1930s, where basically the major British oil companies that have an effective monopoly in colonial India take out a series of totally speculative prospecting licenses in order to exclude American firms from entering into Indian markets, right? And they don't bring any more oil online, right? They just simply take out these licenses to exclude other firms. And this is a kind of historical analog to the point that Mitchell makes, to the point that Jürgen makes in his The Prize or The Quest, whatever that book is called. Maybe there are two books, The Prize and The Quest. I don't know. That's one of the sort of key functions of the oil cartel, of the global oil cartel, as it emerged in the interwar period. It wasn't about producing as much oil as possible. It was about limiting production in order to control price, right? So this kind of mechanism in order to control price is already baked in to the sort of infrastructural and financial logic of the industry, right? And I think that Mitchell is totally right to kind of point that out. And in a way, it's actually his work that his and another scholar, Galpern, who works specifically on the kind of financial aspects of oil, kind of clued me into this whole problematic of kind of what money is doing in relationship to this commodity. So Malviya has this whole criticism of the oil companies. And in fact, when Noharkatia is discovered in 1953, there are all these letters, both within the oil company archives and in Malviya's archives, that basically indicate that the oil company knew about that oil field decades before and chose not to work it, precisely for the reasons that I've just described. So that it wasn't a discovery, right? But it was actually an oil field that was brought online immediately after the crisis of nationalization in Iran, and as a way of sort of these oil companies re-entering into negotiations with the Indian government for market share in new refinery projects, and as a way of offsetting their own financial exposure to what was happening in Iran. So after nationalization in Iran, India and actually Nehru in a certain sense plays along with the companies in this way. So we should never think about this in terms of a sort of like a kind of resistance narrative, right? Like Nehru is actually kind of a sort of ambivalent figure in this drama. So that in the aftermath of Mossadegh's nationalization in Iran, Nehru invites the oil companies back to build their refineries and to shift some of their refining infrastructure and their financial exposure from this kind of geopolitically volatile situation in Iran to the Indian context, right? The last thing I'll say, and you can feel free to push me if I didn't clarify exactly what you wanted me to say, but is that the connection to Iran is really crucial because of one of the reasons why it's crucial is because of the connection between these sterling companies, right? And although they are separate entities, right, the kind of major company operating in India prior to independence is the Burma Oil Company, and the main company that would become British Petroleum is the Anglo-Iranian Company in Iran. But these companies are should be understood as closely nested together, sharing stockholders, raising capital together, sharing interests embedded in the British state, right? So particularly after the Second World War, when the Burma Oil Company's production is totally destroyed, the company itself becomes one of Anglo-Iranian's largest shareholders, and is primarily generating revenue not by producing oil, but on the dividends it's earning from Anglo-Iranian stock price. Anyway, I'll just stop there, but feel free to push me if I didn't answer what you were after.
No, I'll just see if there are any final comments. We have a couple of minutes because I think 2 o'clock people have classes as well. If there is any final comment, we'll have this chat later. I mean, I have a couple of other questions, but if not, thank you very much, Matt, for your time and a very insightful presentation. And look forward to your book. And thank you everyone for participating. You'll find, if you want to have a listen to the talk later, it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to check that out whenever if you want to, and if you have time. And next Wednesday we will be reconvening. I'm just checking who's speaking next week. Next week we have Dr. Emery Kalema, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Stellenbosch University. And he's going to, his paper is titled Space, Mobility and Displacement, the Mulele Rebellion in Post-Colonial Congo. Please join us for that. And thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.